Hi everyone. So welcome to this second session of the conference that will be about planning and need satisfaction. So you all know these two rationale for planning that are first and related to need satisfaction. That are first that the market distorts needs representation, basing it on consumer solvability and on the unequal income distribution that it creates. And second, that it creates what Galbraith called the reverse sequence. That is, it produces artificial needs to obey the imperative of capital accumulation. So against this logic of the market, of distorted and artificial need satisfaction, planning, as Cedric said, would allow for deliberate and political choices on resource allocation, offering the opportunity to reshape the principles according to which needs can be assessed and addressed. So to talk about this subject, we have invited two sociologists that are Razmig, Keucheyan and Silvia, Rief. And I will present them in a row. So Razmig is professor at the University Paris-Cité, and need satisfaction is a central theme of his research. In 2019, he published Artificial Needs: How to Go Away from Consumerism, where he reflects on Agnès Ehler's theory of needs and on the possible institutional and democratic procedures that could help people and society to identify essential and real needs as opposed to artificial needs, and thus to put boundaries to productivism and consumerism. Razmig more recently co-authored with Cédric Durand a book called How to Bifurcate that deals with the very subject of this conference, the institutional foundation of eco-socialism and ecological planning. His talk today is entitled Needs, Institutions and Coalitions. How would democratic ecological planning look like? Silvia Rief is an associate professor at the University of Innsbruck, specializing in interpretative sociology and cultural sociology, and her research interest encompass the intersections of consumption, economic, and technology, as well as history of social sciences. Silvia worked on the socialist calculation debate, that is the main debate about the viability of planning within the history of economic thought that you certainly all know about. In her paper, Karl Polanyi's Socialist Accounting: An Overview in the Age of Data Analytics, she brings a very original and critical perspective on the debate, inspired from a rather unknown part of Karl Polanyi's work. Silvia's paper runs against the epistemological assumptions of the techno-socialist position that argues that data analytics could be used to assess needs and resource allocation as a substitute for the market. And her talk today is entitled Between Calculation and Deliberation, Rethinking Needs in Planning Frameworks. So, Razmig, I leave you the floor.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? Yeah. Hi everyone, it's great to be here. Thanks to the organizers for organizing this great conference. I'm going to talk about the politics of planning. That's the main theme of my talk. Now, historically, the theoretical debate about planning has essentially been framed as a debate about economic calculation. Is planning more or less rational than the market? Rational had different meanings, of course, depending on the author, but its definition was economic, mostly. It had to do with the optimal allocation of resources based often on some cost-benefit calculation. However, governments that attempted to implement some form of planning in the 20th century quickly realized that in addition to being a problem of economic calculation, which it is, of course, planning is at least as much a political problem. These experiments in planning failed for several reasons, but one of them is certainly the underestimation of this political dimension of planning, the level of unpreparedness in this area. Otto Neurath himself, who in the socialist calculation debate did the most to reframe the discussion and move away from a neoclassical framing, did not develop a real political theory of planning himself. His arguments on the incommensurability of values or the embeddedness of the economy in nature call, of course, for the elaboration of this political theory of planning, but he did not elaborate it himself. Now, when one reads the history of actually existing planning, one quickly comes to the conclusion that planning is a complex combination of economic calculation and politics. What do I mean by politics? Politics is, of course, a very complex and polysemic term. I mean at least three things. First, planning involves institutions, more precisely, institutional design. How should we design or redesign our democracies to make them fit or effective for economic planning? What new institutions should we create? What new powers should we confer to older institutions? How, for example, can we strengthen the powers of parliaments or of constitutional courts? Should we create Soviets or an assembly of the future, as Dominique Bourg has proposed? And here, two main approaches are possible. One is realist, in the sense that the starting point of the institutional design is actually existing institutions. And then one asks how can we improve them for planning. So that's the realist approach. The other approach is more utopian. It doesn't really care about actually existing institutions. It asks more abstractly what kind of institutions we need for planning. The second political dimension of planning is the administrative dimension. It is linked, of course, to institutional design, but this is a distinct problem. The administrative dimension of planning is itself divided into two separate problems. First, there's the problem of state capacity. What means does the state have to extract human and material resources within its territory? And what levers does it have to implement its public policies? Now, one of the tragedies of our time, of course, is that the neoliberal state has rendered itself powerless by abandoning its own administrative capacities and entrusting them to the private sector. The other administrative dimension of planning is the question of the boundary between administration and deliberation. You may remember what Oscar Wilde had to say about socialism. The trouble with socialism, said Wilde, is that it takes up too many evenings. Now, Wilde believed that socialism is about permanent general assemblies, yet there are so many things in life more interesting than politics. The socialist response to this argument is that socialism, or planning, is in no way about permanent general assemblies. Assemblies are important, of course, but they are limited in time. Once completed, the administration takes over to implement the democratically determined decisions. So the question of the boundaries between deliberation and administration is in this sense a crucial issue for anyone interested in planning. When does deliberation end and when does the administrative process begin? Which decisions fall under each? This is a crucial problem, but one that was relatively absent from 20th century theoretical debates on planning. Even Neurath, who is sometimes considered to advocate a kind of technocratic planning, does not really address this crucial problem. The third political dimension of planning concerns the coalitions that support planning. In complex societies, including in post-capitalist ones, there will always be conflicting interests. Therefore, planning must have a social base. It will never correspond to all citizens, of course, but it must be a majority, and this majority should be stable. This is the issue of the class coalition that supports planning. Of course, there will be social movements which can change or disrupt existing coalition. This issue of ecological coalitions has been raised by many political scientists, for instance, by Matto Mildenberger in his theory of double representation. So, institutions, administration, coalitions. This is what I call the political dimension of planning. And one of the challenges for us today is to elaborate on this political dimension and also to work on its articulation with the calculation dimension. Now, Cédric and I wrote a book recently that, among other things, addresses this topic. In the book, we propose a political framework for planning, which we call ecological federalism. And I would like to present the core of this model, drawing on the two main historical cases we rely on, which is firstly French indicative planning after the Second World War, and Chinese planning in the last decades of the 20th century. I will not go into details. I will highlight the important elements of these cases in order to illustrate what I believe to be the main points of our framework. France. I begin with French indicative planning. Now, Jean Monnet created the Commissariat Général du Plan in January 1946. And given the challenges of reconstruction after the war, he was immediately led to innovate institutionally. Of course, one never innovates from scratch. One of Jean Monnet's sources of inspiration was, of course, the New Deal. The Commissariat du Plan, for example, was not designed as a ministry. It was an agency in the New Deal sense of the word. It reported directly to the Prime Minister, thus bypassing ministries. The idea was to modernize France after the war. A document from the time referred to France as a backward country, un pays arriéré in French. The central institutional innovation in the early years of the plan were the Commission de Modernisation, modernization committees, created by Jean Monnet and his close collaborator, Étienne Hirsch. Now, these modernization commissions were deliberative bodies. They were composed of hundreds of representatives from civil society, business leaders, trade unionists, consumer association leaders, academics, civil servants, of course, etc. It was a moderate form of economic democracy, the idea being that democracy must enter the economic sphere. There were 18 of them initially, but their number evolved over the course of the plan. Some dealt with general issues like productivity, finance, or territorial organization. Others were more specific, covering construction, agriculture, steel, or culture. The first 18 committees comprised approximately 20% trade unionists, 30% employer representatives, 30% civil servants, and 20% so-called experts, economists, engineers, and like. There were many subcommittees, eventually bringing together 1,000 participants. And they resulted in a Plan de Modernisation de l'Économie, which was an investment plan that aimed at modernizing France. The first of these plans was adopted in January 1947, just a year after the creation of the Commissariat. Once a first version of the plan had been drafted by these committees, the document was reviewed by the Commissariat's council, Central Council. Choices were made, obviously, as the proposals of these committees were not always compatible with each other, or they didn't match the plan's goals, of course. And after being discussed by the Commissariat's council, the Plan de Modernisation was ratified by the National Assembly. Thus, ultimately, national representation, that is parliaments, remained sovereign. In the minds of Monnet and Hirsch, modernization committees had two main objectives. First, to set civil society against the administration, or more precisely, those parts of the administration that, in their eyes, defended the interests of backward France. Now, French-style planning does not consist, as in the experiences of developmental states later in the 20th century, of giving all power to an administration, insulated from the demands of civil society. Think, for instance, of the Japanese MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry. French-style planning places the administration in tension with civil society. An important point is that these committees were not meant to be an accurate representation of French society or of the French economy. Their composition itself and the topics about which they discussed were decided by the Commissariat, by the government, and by Parliament. So this is not an exercise in what we would call participatory democracy. Secondly, the idea was to involve in the very elaboration of the plan the people who would implement it. Monnet's idea is that planning will be all the more legitimate and seriously implemented the more its stakeholders are involved upstream. French planning, in addition to being indicative, is said to be concerted, meaning it is the result of deliberation between the social forces that are present. At the heart of French planning is a particular social group, which are civil servants, often young, because the older ones often collaborated with the German occupiers during the war, with a profile halfway between technical expertise, that means that they mastered economic models up to a point, and politics on the other side. These planners had considerable influence. They framed problems, led negotiations between economic sectors, and most importantly, they translated the language of economists for politicians and vice versa. They thus embodied in their very persons the combination of the calculation and the political dimension of planning. I think one of the challenges for us today is to ask ourselves whether a similar group should drive ecological planning, and if so, what type of training this group should receive. A crucial final point on French planning, these micro-level modernization commissions would have been powerless without the existence of a powerful nationalized sector. This sector allowed control of what Lenin would call the commanding heights of the economy: credit, insurance, energy, transportation, infrastructure, and the like. And through this, they steered the economy and they provided instructions or impulses to the market. The nationalization of banks and insurance companies in particular shows that the socialization of investment is an essential part of any form of planning, whether it takes place in a capitalist or socialist context. While French-style planning is considered indicative, it also has a coercive dimension. This socialization provides the state with the levers to discipline capital, for example, through conditionalities attached to credit or subsidies. China. Chinese planning in the last decades of the 20th century and the first decades of the 21st century, of course, belongs to a very different history than French planning. However, several commentators have noted similarities between the two, although to my knowledge, no systematic comparison exists. I'm not an expert in China, but in my view, this comparison highlights some of the key issues we face today. China's originality consists in combining centralization and decentralization as part of its strategy to catch up with advanced economies. One term used in this regard is regionally decentralized authoritarianism. In concrete terms, a reform is first tested in one or a few provinces. This was the case, for example, with the famous special economic zones in the 1980s. If the results are conclusive, it is extended to other provinces and eventually to the entire country. If not, it is abandoned. The advantages of this decentralized authoritarianism are several. First, if the experiment fails, its negative effects are contained within the boundaries of the province concerned, and the rest of the country is not affected. This allows for risks to be taken, but also for mistakes to be corrected before eventually generalizing the reform. This method also aims to gain stakeholder support through practice. A policy can be tried even if it is not initially unanimously supported. Its success will convince the skeptics. Lowering the scale of the experiment is a way to resolve the power struggle between supporters and opponents. Sometimes the smaller the scale of the experiment, the less complex it is to form majorities in favor of it. This is the advantage of federalism, and Switzerland would be another example that illustrates this principle. Decentralization also allows for experimentation to be carried out by the people concerned, those who live in the area where it takes place, and not by the center of the system. This would be the Chinese equivalent of the concerted dimension of French planning. Lower levels are sometimes pitted against each other. The center sets a goal, for example, improving air quality. Then it's up to the provinces to find ways to implement it. After that, a performance ranking is made public. In China, to reach the top of the Communist Party hierarchy, among other criteria, one must have performed well in those rankings. If a province has performed well, its power relative to others increases, and thus its leaders can rise through the ranks. The cyclical dimension of Chinese planning is absolutely crucial. Here, again, there's an affinity with the French model. In China, a planning cycle consists of two phases, one during which lower levels are encouraged to experiment, the other during which these experiments are examined, then confirmed, generalized, or abandoned, depending on their success, and of course the plan's goals. In the second phase, preparation of the next 5-year plan also begins with successive plans, thus overlapping in some sense. So this is not a kind of planning that is implemented top-down unilaterally. And as in the French case, this process implies that the state, and more precisely the PCC, controls the commanding heights of the economy: banks, energy, telecommunication, transportation, and so on. Through this, the PCC, the state is able to provide instructions or impulses to the market and also manage crises, like today. Although Chinese planning is decentralized, it also involves, of course, a strong element of centralization. The state and the CCP control the main levers of economic activity. The various administrations engage in competition with each other, which can be more or less fierce depending on the period. In modern society, coherence in public policy is always relative, in a sense. This is the case in China, in France, or anywhere else. The essence of what we call ecological federalism with Cédric consists of the combination of two mechanisms. First, the cyclical nature of planning, and second, the dialectic of decentralization and centralization. And the crucial point is that the two are linked. This is the crucial point. The cyclicality of planning in France and China is not simply a succession of 5-year plans. The different moments of the cycle provide an opportunity to change scale. In the French case, changing scale involves deliberation in the Commission de Modernisation, as I said. In the Chinese case, it involves the experimental phase of planning at lower administrative levels. But in both cases, the idea is that making planning legitimate and therefore effective requires organizing it at the lowest possible level and involving those who will implement it in its elaboration. The federalist dimension of our framework helps improve the quality of the democratic process, the deliberation about needs, in other words. All sorts of experiments are conceivable at the lower level: cooperatives, transition towns, Soviets, whatever. The ecological transition will have a grassroots dimension. Yet debates about planning today have, in my opinion, struggled until now to take into account this crucial grassroots dimension, connect with it, in a sense. Yet a federalist framework allows precisely to do that. It also allows experiments in participatory and deliberative democracy, like the Convention citoyenne sur le climat that we had in France in 2019 and 2020. Decentralization is also a response to Hayek's objections to planning. For Hayek, as was presented, imperative planning had an epistemological flaw. Bureaucrats, unlike market operators, do not have sufficient knowledge of the local circumstances of economic activity to make rational decisions. This leads them to produce too much or too little, or to produce poor quality goods. To my knowledge, Hayek never discussed the French planning experiment. But perhaps precisely because it is immune, in part at least, to this epistemological objection. More generally, if we put aside purely theoretical debates and focus on what real-life planners have done, actually did in the past and will do in the future, I think the epistemological problems raised by Hayek and others sometimes at least find concrete solutions in certain planning experiments. Our ecological federalism also differs from what is called polycentrism in the tradition of the theory of the commons. Polycentrism is the form of governance of the commons imagined by Elinor Ostrom and her colleagues. As its name suggests, in this case, there are several centers who are constantly negotiating with each other on how to use the commons, the common resources. However, in ecological federalism, there is a single center. Contrary to current belief, federalist regimes, even the most decentralized ones, such as Switzerland, have always had very strong centralization mechanisms, particularly in the event of crises. Two further points before the conclusion. Do I have time left? Yeah, I think 5? 9 minutes. Okay, that'll be okay. Two further points and then the conclusion. First, coalition building is possible at the local level, as I said about the Chinese case, but the state can also help bring about coalition at the national level. For example, one of the driving ideas behind the Inflation Reduction Act under Joe Biden in the US was to combine environmentalism with national security issues. The development of renewable energy is not only good for the planet, so the argument went, but it is also good to make the US more independent from an energy point of view. In this way, the state connects in an interventionist or voluntarist manner two sectors of the society, US society in this case, with previously separate, even opposing interests. Supporters of renewable energy on the one side, and the military on the other, by forcing them to work together at the national level. Moreover, law, constitutional law in particular, is a powerful tool for centralization at the state level. And this is a topic we talk about in the book. A movement in constitutional law dating back some 30 years or so, which we discuss in the book, is so-called environmental constitutionalism. The idea is to introduce increasingly demanding ecological standards in constitutions, so as to compel economic actors, but also citizens, to respect those norms. Once an environmental norm is integrated into the Constitution, it also trickles down to lower jurisdictions in everyday legal practice. Some Latin American countries, notably Ecuador, are very advanced in this direction. Conclusion. A crucial lesson of the French case is that in 1945, the French ruling classes went through a very deep crisis of legitimacy. And this deep crisis of legitimacy is precisely what allowed for the implementation of heterodox economic policies. During the war, a large part of the French bourgeoisie had collaborated with the Nazis. And the balance of power after the war favored workers, especially since they paid such a high price during the resistance, during the war. If indicative French-style planning became possible after the war, along with nationalizations and the creation also of social security, it is precisely because the ruling classes offered very limited resistance at that time, because they were in a crisis of legitimacy. This crisis of legitimacy of the ruling classes could also be observed in the United States in the 1920s and 30s. During the Great Depression, Roosevelt was able to implement the New Deal because capitalism was on the verge of collapse. The US bourgeoisie was then prepared to make any concessions in exchange for its survival. Roosevelt transformed the American state by developing its administrative capacities, the very ones that Donald Trump is trying to destroy now, and by taking control of the investment function. The state imposed its discipline to capital. This was the first New Deal, the most radical. Once accumulation was restarted, the capitalists were back. They threatened Roosevelt with investment strike if he did not moderate his policies. Our situation today is not the same at all. The 2008 crisis was comparable in scale to the Great Depression, but due to the massive injection of liquidity by central banks, it resulted in a recession rather than a depression. Today, it is the working classes that offer little resistance to capital. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, revolts have emerged, think of Occupy Wall Street and the like, left-wing populisms have appeared, and sometimes come close to power, but no alternative project to neoliberalism has emerged. The bourgeoisie remains on the offensive. The bourgeoisie, however incoherent, remains on the offensive today. Lenin is sometimes attributed with this phrase: there are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. I'm not sure it's a phrase by Lenin, but it is often said that it is Lenin that said that. Yet, this acceleration of historical time can only happen, and Lenin knew that, when the dominant classes are discredited, when they are in a crisis of deep legitimacy. And this is precisely why supporters of planning, as we are, should take part in wider social movements that aim to bring about precisely this outcome that Lenin was talking about, that is the weakening of the dominant classes, as a condition for heterodox policies and planning to be implemented. Thank you.
This is in French.
You can start here.
Okay.
And then if you want this.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be here at this exciting workshop. Between calculation and deliberation, rethinking the category of needs in planning. As you have heard, I'm a sociologist, but also a bit of a mixture in terms of training in history, and I'm working on the early social sciences in Austria. And I haven't really worked on planning so far, but I've had the chance to delve into Karl Polanyi's early work on socialist accounting. I'm not sure how familiar you are with this work. I won't touch a lot of Polanyi today, but my goal in this presentation is to pick up a key premise within schemes for economic planning, and that is the notion that planning is oriented to the fulfillment of human needs and staying within ecological boundaries. But I'd like to focus on this notion of planning for needs. Lots of questions are attached to this notion, like how can knowledge about human needs be gained? How do we know if needs have been satisfied by certain measures or policies? Should needs be objectively or subjectively be defined? What are social needs? What do we actually mean by saying we deliberate over needs? So my presentation is divided into two parts. I will first, as I said, I'm also a bit of an historian, delve into just an example of a historical understanding or earlier understanding of the notion of need or its conceptual history, focusing on the German context, since I'm from the German-speaking world. I will then address some assumptions that are recurring in the planning literature about needs and how they're conceptualized and framed. I will look at some contemporary examples and how they typically address this issue. And in the second part of my talk, I brought you some Austrian stuff from the socialist calculation debate. Polanyi, by the way, was also involved in this. And criticized by Mises. But I'd also like to draw your attention to Karl Menger's second edition of his Principles of Economics. You might be familiar with his theory of needs and economizing, which has been hugely influential and I think also quite broadly been interpreted and maybe misappropriated. There's a lot of current debate arising again on Menger and on Neurath again, but not on Neurath's accounting in kind. I'd like to point to some other interesting arguments in relation to planning. Neurath would suggest a conceptual alternative. He doesn't really talk about needs, but about life conditions or life situations. So I'm not suggesting that these guys help us to develop a systematic, definite solution, but I think they raise some interesting points that might help us to rethink and refine this debate around needs. And they also, to some extent, obviously they overlap, they diverge from each other, and some of their arguments might also relate quite well to some current theories around needs. So we do have, that's my message or my interpretation, that we do have theories of needs, but we don't necessarily have a theory of planning for needs. Yeah, and so let's have a look. I'm not sure whether there are some similar traditions also in the Anglo-Saxon world, but the modern or the medieval feudal concept of need was necessitas domestica, and it was derived from the Latin necessitas, but there was also another Latin term, indigentia, which meant hardship. Necessitas was an early expression of the idea of basic rights to subsistence in the feudal period. In German, it was called Notdurft or Hausnotdurft. It referred to the needs of a household for maintaining its basic subsistence. It established a norm of legitimate usage for the shared use of common lands. And it was limited by what was essential for subsistence, which was, however, differentiated by social state. Let's not forget that. But it also extended to the regulation of compulsory labor services in feudal society, which were, at least in principle, limited by the basic needs of both the peasants and the lords. So the peasants' labor services were to secure the lords' domestic necessities, but were not to be exploited beyond this purpose. So crucially, necessitas domestica explicitly framed overconsumption or luxury as a use of goods at the expense of others' needs for subsistence. Thus, it represented a broader normative ideal, setting not only minimum standards, but also defining levels of excessive use. Now, this regulatory idea eroded with the expansion of commodity markets and so on. Necessitas shifted toward utilitas, referring to individual subsistence. And especially by the 18th century, cameralistic political science redefined need as a driver of work, production, and growth. So in Jean Baudrillard's critical perspective, the modern notion of need introduced a functional logic, prompting, quote, the whole psychoeconomic ideology of optimality, equilibrium, functional regulation, and adaptation of needs. And I think we need to think about this genealogy of this concept of need, which also shaped discourses in economics and in literatures on economic planning, which tend to frame needs as utilitas, assuming that an individual's relation to goods is mediated by needs, that needs are given before and independent of the encounter with goods, and can be inferred from records of past purchases. Needs are generally grasped in their quantitative dimension only, in line with the dominant framework of macroeconomic planning. The socialist literature in particular was at the vanguard of shaping the idea of social needs, a polysemic and sometimes quite loose term, variably referring to the needs of society as a whole, to the aggregate demand, or to the shared similar needs of individuals, to the needs of organizations, or that individual needs cannot be satisfied independently of society. So importantly, in this socialist tradition, planning is seen to involve the conscious adaptation of economic activities towards social needs and use values. Despite these broadly defined tasks of socialist planning, the actual focus of many market socialist planning schemes tended to be confined to balancing supply and demand. So as I perceive it, and this view may be limited, but my sense is that the dominant frame here is that first we have needs, then we have plans, then we go to production, and we generate some goods to satisfy these needs. So in other words, there is some kind of bias towards planning for production, whereas planning for consumption systems somehow lags behind, also in this planning debate. Now, there are two, I think, key strategies within the contemporary proposals for planning, which also are sometimes combined, and this also makes sense. We have various computerized models that build on statistical methodologies of some kind. And some of the recent proposals also attempt modeling in multiple kinds instead of using single units, such as money or labor time. And we have planning proposals that emphasize deliberation to identify needs, which also come in various shapes: reform socialist, more liberal proposals, or more radical democratic proposals. And what I tried to do in my paper, I looked at some of these contemporary proposals and to see how they address this idea of planning for needs. Now, just to give you a brief overview of the algorithmic models and the kind of concepts, methods, and data they use, my analysis resulted in the notion that, well, there is a lot of emphasis on needs being equated with final consumption, with consumer demand or interest. However, we see different ideas around private individual needs or basic needs or societal needs. The methods are pretty similar, and there are variations, of course, how these methods get applied. And in terms of the data, the key source of information on needs are typically data on effective demand, mostly gathered ex post. One exception being Sauras's model of advance need or good registration in this general catalog, a sort of production on demand model. Of interest is also how they balance and integrate the goal of planning for needs with the goal of limiting resource extraction, which is done by rationing by price, or planners setting limits, or some sort of societal agreements. Now let's zoom in on two interesting current schemes that aim to implement calculation in multiple kinds. The half-Earth socialism model uses linear programming to simulate various scenarios at global scale and make visible possible trade-offs between discrete and incommensurable goals as a basis for democratic deliberation. Instead of a single unit, it uses metrics such as calorie quotas per person, production costs measured in hectares, or in carbon emissions. As the authors quite laxly remark, quote, "We toss in limits on resource use and the minimum needs of humanity and turn the crank." So quantitative modeling and simulation of some sort are needed for global planning, but here it is unresolved how limits and pathways would be defined in such a global rationing economy, and whether such an economy would find popular consent. An interesting model for accounting in kind is the holistic and integrated life cycle sustainability assessment by two German authors, which combines biophysical, economic, and social indicators, including some qualitative ones, to calculate the natural and social costs of products. So this is an accounting scheme which builds on the notion of social needs, measured either through effective demand, that is some kind of payment in consumer tokens, or operationalized on the basis of the sustainable development goals. It starts from accounting in various kinds, but then uses weighting and aggregation of some sort to determine aggregate scores for certain product systems. Accounting here is mostly limited to the cost side. It does not yet include metrics to measure and compare user satisfaction with certain products or their contribution to need fulfillment. The question is also what sort of measures or indicators for social justice could be used to account for the distribution of goods and social justice on that side, not only the social costs of work and labor. Now, proposals for the political deliberation over needs, as I said, come in various shapes. There is the reform socialist approach by Pat Devine, where the notion is really economic planning should be shaped to the needs of the people. More liberal models restrict deliberation to public issues only, and whereas radical democratic models aim to extend the realm of socialized provision and to politicize questions of private life, to question the boundaries between private and public. And they also argue that democratic deliberation does not simply reveal information about needs, but fosters a collective learning process that might lead to a modified understanding of needs and need satisfiers. But what is sometimes also acknowledged in the literature that we lack concrete proposals of how deliberation over needs is to be carried out. Let's again look briefly at two examples. The negotiated coordination model by Devine prioritizes the need for personal development. So a prime goal would be to minimize time for unrewarding activities by reorganizing the social division of labor. Other needs are framed as consumer demand and interest, for which Devine proposes two sources of information. Quantitative, that is data on effective demand, which are seen to indicate social value, and qualitative data, which would be gathered from interest groups that represent consumer voice in these negotiation bodies. The Paracon model by Albert and Hanel suggests a different way for identifying consumption needs. So neighborhood councils would aggregate the approved individual consumption requests of all households in the neighborhoods. Other records would be used for missing submissions, and if the individual consumption allowance is exceeded, changes will be demanded. But only public consumption issues of the neighborhood are determined through participatory planning. Consumption rights of individuals are based on effort and sacrifice at work, with co-workers or worker councils doing the effort rating. Now, this is a brief overview of some current models, and I'm curious whether you found other models or proposals which address needs in an entirely different way. But let me turn to some of the older stuff now. There is a lot of debate on Karl Menger, and you may know that Hayek and Robbins embraced Menger as their forerunner to build a microeconomic theory around the scarcity postulate, claiming marginalism for economic liberalism. Robbins' scarcity postulate refers to the subjective choice and trade-offs between the alternative uses of scarce means to achieve multiple desired ends. This contrasts with the notion of economizing that Menger sets out in his untranslated second edition of Principles of Economics. It's still untranslated, and the debate is still going on whether it should be translated or it should be forgotten. But there is an interesting current article by Erwin Decker on Menger's theory of needs. Menger's economizing emphasizes, and that's interesting, the efficient use of goods to satisfy their needs, whether of individuals or human associations, as completely as possible. And I argue it lays the basis not for maximizing, but for frugal provisioning of resources for need satisfaction. Economizing in Menger's sense involves knowledge of needs and when and where they will arise, knowledge of the relative importance of the satisfaction of particular needs, prioritizing the most important needs over the less important ones, gaining knowledge of the proportion of goods that will become available in a certain period, preventing loss and decay, satisfying needs with the least possible quantity of goods, temporarily distributing the available goods over the period of provision. And I suggest this economizing may not necessarily be an individual activity of some kind of rational actor, but may become part of a collective deliberative process. Menger's holistic notion of the needs of human associations that he puts forward in this second edition pushes him towards an implicit reflection of economic planning for a population's needs. And I'm saying an implicit reflection of planning. He never uses the word planning, but he uses the term wahre Volkswirtschaft, which has as its aim the highest welfare of all members. So the economy becomes a form of precautionary householding of stocks for need satisfaction. Menger develops, and I really have to cut it short, there's a lot in there, and I can only cover a few things. Menger develops the following notions of need, which he analytically separates from the institutional form of provision, whether this is public provision, private provision, or some kind of cooperative type of provision. He talks about individual needs. He talks about uniform or similar individual needs. But collective needs are those needs where a group of individuals recognizes, okay, here we really need a shared good to cover our shared needs. It would make sense to build some kind of water provisioning system or network to cover our shared needs for water. Whether water is then privately or publicly provided is another matter, but the collective need is when a group recognizes it has a need for a shared good. Then he talks about the needs of human associations or organizational needs, which are more than the needs of individual members. And another interesting term is this notion of sozialer Bedarf, for which I really couldn't come up with a proper translation, because it does not mean demand or consumer purchasing behavior or something like that. Sozialer Bedarf is the total quantity of the required consumption goods of a population in a definite period to satisfy individual and social needs. So Bedarf is not the same as effective demand. So Menger's idea of caring for these needs involves three important variables. This is Bedarf, or this total quantity of required goods, the goods available, and the time period for which provision should be organized or planned. And an important distinction that Menger also makes is that between needs and goods. He explicitly emphasizes this difference, arguing that a thing becomes a good only when recognized by an individual as capable of satisfying a need. And in the second edition, he specifies these needs that are recognized as such. So there are two acts of recognition involved here. The recognition of needs and the recognition of some kind of object as a need satisfier. Needs are rooted in nature, but they don't determine us. So there is, and also the subjective recognition of a thing as a good may not be the same as the general recognition of a thing as a good. So this comes really from his subjective value theory. But he also emphasizes this arbitrariness, that needs can be satisfied with different goods and goods can have different purposes and so on. But the point is that effective demand does not necessarily highlight needs. And this point is also quite similar in Polanyi's writings on socialist accounting. Here, as I've argued in this paper, or shown in this paper, he's very much critical of statistics and top-down bureaucratic overview. He argues for empathic understanding of the subjective elements of the economic process. Some sense of the lived experiences was required. And he picked up this notion of British guild socialism, the functional democratic representations and organizations, where people would deliberate and talk about their motivations, their experiences of hardship, and the intensity and direction of needs in the context of their lives. A key task that Polanyi ascribed to the economic manager, as a quote, was to balance satisfaction of needs with the pain and effort of work. That is, for decisions over production, the desired use values, required resources, costs and sacrifices and burdens of work, all have to be weighed up against each other. So it's a kind of cost-benefit balancing, but in terms of the what use values do we gain and what are the costs of labor and the sacrifices and burdens of work. Like Menger, as I said, he suggests that records of past consumer demand do not indicate present or future needs. And I've picked out this quote from a translated piece on his economic writings, which were translated a couple of years ago. As regards needs, as he says, for example, these are simply assumed to be known without difficulty. To be on the safe side and to give, to some extent, a substitute for the neglected needs, actual consumption in the past period is offhandedly put in place of current needs. Needs and consumption are, however, two totally different things, as everybody whose actual consumption does not satisfy his needs knows perfectly well. Previous actual consumption would more closely correspond to present needs if, among other things, it had coincided with previous needs, and if needs had remained unchanged. To establish this, however, requires that needs be known first. Now, Polanyi is very positive about democratic deliberation and that conflicting claims by members can be brought into balance and into a just relationship. But we might, there is a lot of critical debate also over deliberation and needs recognition in public arenas. Nancy Fraser has also written about it in an old piece called The Politics of Need Interpretation, where she argues that there are a lot of competing discourses and unequal resources. So this is not necessarily a very straightforward process. Now, let me finally, if I have some time, I don't know how much I've got.
3 more minutes.
Okay, I'll have to wrap it up. Neurath, you may be familiar with his accounting in kind and his broader notion of well-being. What he emphasizes is it's not the socialist economy would not just take into account the health and well-being of the worker, but also would have to take into account the final product that indirectly influences his condition of life. So the ultimate goal of planning is to raise the overall quality of life, which depends on the conditions of life, which again are affected by the order of life, the economic order, the policies, the plans. And the task of planning for Neurath is to systematically compare and evaluate how concrete policies affect or correlate with life conditions, like housing, health, leisure time, and so on. and how these conditions are distributed across groups. To capture and compare the complexities of life conditions, he proposes social statistics and multi-criteria methods rather than aggregate scores. For example, the Silhouette method of comparing magnitudes across multiple dimensions, or the inventories of life conditions that he tried to develop. Now let me wrap me up some implications. Menger and Polanyi both note the limitations of equating needs with records of past consumer behavior. This risks path dependencies. So we might need to think about which data could be used, or which data might be problematic. They think that data and accounting techniques of market society are inadequate for economic planning of a population's welfare. Following Menger, an economy oriented to human and social needs would not be a subsistence economy. He thinks that this is not about Lebensnotdurft, but about all other needs, and not about, he doesn't talk about minimum standards or minimum resources. The latter are prerequisites rather than direct measures of well-being, as welfare economists have also emphasized. So I think with Menger we could not only think, some current research on consumption corridors proposes similar ideas to think about minimum and maximum levels, or the floors and the ceilings. But I think Menger nevertheless suggests economizing the use of goods for needs. Another, I think, important point is that beyond the cost-based assessment of products, like in this holistic accounting scheme, which accounts for social costs and ecological impact in production, planning should also evaluate the contribution of policies and goods as need satisfiers to well-being, the improvement of life conditions and equity. Despite the advocating different methods and techniques, Neurath was very much into statistics, Polanyi wasn't, but their shared message was that needs and need satisfiers must be seen in the context of broader life situations of groups. Also talking about social recognition, civic liberties, Neurath and also Polanyi, they were both very much emphasizing this notion of personal freedom and liberty, which must be maintained in planning contexts. Some may argue that Neurath's skepticism on calculative commensuration may go too far. If so, a middle position would be to combine commensuration and aggregation with multi-criteria decision-making in democratic deliberation. However, it should also bring indicators, weighting systems, and algorithmic decision-making tools into critical discussion. Not only the calculative commensuration has its problems, but the public deliberation over needs might also have its limitations. Not just because of the conflicts and stalemate situations that may arise, but I wish to conclude with a word of warning from Hannah Arendt, who of course was very keen on maintaining the public and private sphere. But she warned that the focus on a world shared together, on the political, may easily be lost when public debate becomes preoccupied with haggling over private life processes and needs. Okay, and I'll leave it here and hope for interesting discussion. Thank you.